The millionaire widower wanted a new mother for his son, a woman who could bring joy back to that silent mansion. He introduced the boy to 5 beautiful women, all rich, elegant, and eager to take on the role. But the boy's heart, wounded by the loss of his mother, had already chosen the only person who showed him true affection. So, at the moment of the big choice, in front of all the candidates, the boy ignored the women in expensive dresses, ran across the room, and threw himself into the arms of the simple cleaning lady. The scene left everyone, especially the father, in complete shock. The empire Arthur built was a monument to his solitude. From the meticulously manicured gardens to the marble corridors that echoed with emptiness, the mansion was a silent palace, a fortress built on the capital of a lifetime of ruthless deals. He was a man who understood numbers, of stocks rising on Wall Street and the weight of gold stored in secure vaults. His fortune was a living entity, a giant he fed with shrewd investments and a market sense that turned everything he touched into profit. Yet, amidst so much wealth, there was a silence that all the dollars in the world could not fill. Ever since his beloved wife, Clara, had passed, taken by a sudden illness, the heart of the house had stopped beating, and at the center of that silence lived his son, Leo, a 7-year-old little prince, confined within the golden walls of that luxurious cage. From his office, a sanctuary of mahogany and leather overlooking the labyrinthine gardens, Arthur watched his son through a series of high-definition monitors. It wasn't the market tickers that held his attention, but the small figure of Leo, sitting alone on the swing set Clara had insisted on installing. The boy wasn't swinging. He just sat there, motionless, his small feet hovering over the perfect grass, his gaze lost on some distant point Arthur couldn't reach. The man, practical and accustomed to solving any problem with his checkbook or a direct order, felt an impotence that gnawed at him from within. He had already filled the boy's room with every imaginable toy, hired the best tutors and child psychologists, but Leo's sadness was a stubborn liability on his emotional balance sheet, a debt he didn't know how to repay. That morning, after a sleepless night analyzing reports on his assets in Europe, Arthur made a decision. His mind, trained to optimize cash flow and maximize returns, saw the situation with a brutal corporate clarity. Leo didn't need more assets. He didn't need more lessons or trips. What his son needed, the highest return investment that could be made in his life, was something money couldn't create from scratch, but perhaps it could find. He needed a new mother. And, as with all his most important business ventures, Arthur began a meticulous selection process. For weeks, his assistants worked in secret, compiling a dossier on the most promising candidates. The criteria were clear, objective, like those for a corporate merger. Women from prominent families, with excellent educations, unquestionable beauty, and of course, a financial standing that placed them above any suspicion of petty interest. There were 5 names, 5 detailed profiles with photographs and life histories. They were what the world would consider a perfect match, women who could manage a household like his and present themselves with elegance at social events, strengthening the public image of his empire. He reviewed each file, analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of each eye, as if choosing a new CEO for one of his companies. It was a logical solution, a calculated strategy to restore order and happiness to his home. Meanwhile, in a discreet area of the mansion, the head housekeeper, the severe Mrs. Albright, interviewed a candidate for a cleaning position. A simple woman with a shy smile and calloused hands, named Helena. She was hired for a modest salary, an insignificant cog in the machinery of that gigantic house, destined to polish the silver and ensure the gleam of wealth never faded. Arthur barely noticed her hiring in the month's expense reports. His focus was on the big project, the definitive solution to his son's problem. He printed the final list with the names of the 5 candidates and marked a date on his calendar. The plan was set. He closed the dossier with a sharp click, the sound of a verdict. Tomorrow, the first candidate would arrive, and the selection process for his son's heart would begin. The first candidate was named Isabella. She arrived in a gleaming sedan that shone as much as the discreet jewels in her ears. She was the personification of elegance, with an Ivy League degree and a surname that opened doors in the most exclusive circles. To Arthur, she represented a safe investment, a partner who would understand the value of his estate and the importance of appearances, the perfect woman to be the hostess of his home and the image of a mother for his son. Lunch was served in the formal dining room, under a crystal chandelier that reflected the sunlight onto the polished silver. Mrs. Albright, the housekeeper, supervised everything with the precision of a general, ensuring every fork was aligned to the millimeter. Isabella tried, with a genuine effort, to connect with Leo. "So, Leo," she said, with a rehearsed smile that didn't reach her eyes, "your father tells me you have many toys. Which is your favorite?" Leo, who had barely touched his food, shrugged. "I don't know," he mumbled. His gaze fixed on an empty spot on the linen tablecloth. Arthur intervened, trying to fill the awkward silence. "Leo has the best video games, the latest on the market. He's a lucky boy." But the conversation died there, a deflated balloon of formality. The wealth that surrounded them seemed to erect invisible walls between them, turning the meal into a tedious business meeting. Meanwhile, Helena, on her first official day, was dusting a bookshelf in the adjacent living room, always under the watchful eye of Mrs. Albright. She moved with a silent, almost invisible efficiency. From her position, she could see Leo's small figure at the table. She noticed something no one else seemed to perceive. When dessert was served, a delicate chocolate cake, the boy ate only half. With a quick, discreet movement, he wrapped the remaining piece in a napkin and hid it in his pocket. Mrs. Albright frowned, a gesture of clear disapproval at the lack of manners, but said nothing in front of the guest. Helena, however, saw something different. It wasn't an act of defiance or poor etiquette. There was a purpose in the boy's gesture, a secret he guarded with the seriousness of a child. After lunch, Isabella presented Leo with a state-of-the-art drone, the huge, colorful box promising hours of fun. Leo thanked her with the politeness he had been taught, but his eyes remained dull. The gift was just another object, another item to be added to the collection of things that couldn't touch his sadness. When Isabella finally left, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume, Arthur felt the weight of failure. The operation had not yielded the expected profit. The perfect candidate had failed the most crucial test. Later, in his office, the millionaire resorted to his habit of watching the world through his cameras. He scrolled through the day's footage, frustrated. It was then that he saw it. Leo slipped out the back door and ran toward the kennel where Zeus, the guard dog, was resting. The boy took the piece of cake from his pocket and offered it to the animal, who devoured it gratefully. Arthur's heart tightened. It was a gesture of pure, simple friendship. A few minutes later, the recording showed Helena passing by at the end of her shift. She stopped, saw the licked clean dog bowl, and then looked back toward the house. A soft, genuine smile full of understanding lit up her face for an instant. Arthur zoomed in on the image. That smile intrigued him. It was as if she knew his son's little secret. A strange feeling, a mix of relief and an inexplicable suspicion, began to form inside him. Who was this woman who, on her first day, seemed to understand more about his son than he did? The next candidate, Beatrice, was the opposite of Isabella's formality. She arrived in a sleek sports convertible, wearing designer jeans and a leather jacket that exuded an air of modernity and adventure. She was a young tech entrepreneur, a brilliant mind who had turned a small startup into a multi-million-dollar business. Arthur admired her for her acumen and energy. Perhaps this was what Leo needed, a breath of vitality to dispel the melancholy that hung over the mansion. She didn't try to impress with polite conversation. Instead, she sat on the living room floor with the boy, opening a box that contained an advanced robotics kit. "We can build a robot that obeys your voice commands," she said, enthusiastic. "Isn't that amazing?" Leo watched the pieces scattered across the Persian rug with polite curiosity. He even helped snap some of the components together, following Beatrice's animated instructions. But his heart wasn't in it. As his fingers assembled the robot circuitry, his mind was far away, and a low, melancholic hum escaped his lips. It was a simple, childish melody he would hum quietly when he thought he was alone, a song Clara used to sing to him. Beatrice, focused on the task and the goal of impressing the father through technology, didn't even notice. To her, the boy's silence was just a space to be filled with her own enthusiasm. Arthur, watching from a distance, felt the same disappointment as the day before. It was another emotional investment with zero return. The woman might understand cryptocurrency and stock options, but the language of a sad child's soul was one she didn't speak. The next day, the household routine continued its immutable course. Beatrice's robot sat assembled on a shelf, untouched, another trophy of adult misunderstanding. Leo was sitting on the porch, drawing in a notebook. When Helena appeared to clean the glass on the French doors, she moved with the quiet grace of someone who doesn't want to disturb the world. As she wiped the glass in circular motions, she began to hum. It was the same melody, the little bird's song her grandmother had taught her, the same one Leo had been humming the day before. The colored pencil stopped mid-stroke. Leo slowly lifted his head, his eyes wide with surprise. He looked at Helena, who continued her work. Her gaze focused on the glass, as if she didn't realize the effect her song was having. She didn't look back at him, didn't offer an intrusive smile. She just shared the melody with the air, an anonymous gift left in the space between them. For an instant, a glimmer of genuine joy appeared on the boy's face. He was no longer invisible. Someone had heard him. Someone knew his song. The scene, however, did not go unnoticed by Mrs. Albright. The housekeeper, watching everything from an upstairs window, saw the silent exchange. She saw the boy stop drawing. She saw the cleaning woman humming. To her, this wasn't an act of kindness, but a dangerous breach of protocol, an unacceptable familiarity. It was a subordinate employee trying to ingratiate herself, overstepping the boundaries of her position. The housekeeper's face became a mask of ice. Later, when she found Helena in the service hallway, her voice was a cold, sharp whisper. "Your duties in this house are very clear, Helena. You clean, you remain silent. Any behavior that crosses that line will not be tolerated." She paused, her eyes fixed on Helena's, ensuring the threat was understood. "Consider this your only warning." The third and fourth candidates, Sophia and Valentina, arrived together at Arthur's invitation for a picnic in the gardens. He thought a less formal approach, a more relaxed setting, might break the ice. Sophia was the heiress to a vast real estate fortune, with classic beauty and impeccable manners. Valentina was a renowned visual artist whose surname was tied to one of the country's oldest and wealthiest families. Both represented the pinnacle of what heritage and lineage could offer. They were polite, charming, and utterly focused on the mission of winning over the little prince of this kingdom. They brought gifts that reflected their personalities. Sophia gave Leo a miniature pony, a docile and perfectly trained creature, a luxury only great wealth could provide. Valentina, in turn, presented him with a professional set of oil paints and a canvas, encouraging him to express his feelings through art. Leo thanked them both with the same distant courtesy as always. He petted the pony, but showed no interest in riding it. He looked at the paints, but made no move to open the tubes. To him, they were just more objects, more expectations he didn't know how to meet. The picnic unfolded under the shade of a century-old oak tree. Sophia and Valentina competed for the boy's attention, asking questions about his school, his friends, his hobbies. But their questions sounded like an interrogation, a checklist to understand the asset's interests. Leo answered in monosyllables, his blue eyes wandering across the garden, searching for something that wasn't there. The conversation was an exercise in futility, a dialogue between worlds that didn't connect. Their wealth created a barrier, a formality that prevented any real connection. They spoke of trips to Paris and ski lessons in Aspen, while the boy's universe was reduced to the longing for a lullaby and the secret of a shared piece of cake. Meanwhile, Helena had been assigned a task far from the guests, eyes, cleaning out the old tool shed at the back of the garden. It was heavy. Solitary work, a veiled punishment from Mrs. Albright for her previous insubordination. The place was dusty and filled with forgotten objects. In a corner, covered by a tarp, she found an old wooden box. Curious, she opened it. Inside were small woodworking tools and several pieces of wood, remnants of some old project. Helena smiled. It brought back memories of her father, a humble carpenter who had taught her to carve small animals in her childhood. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Leo discreetly walk away from the picnic. He wandered aimlessly, hands in his pockets, head down. On an impulse, Helena picked up a small piece of wood and a carving knife from the box. She sat on the shed step, in a spot where the boy could see her, but without making it seem like an invitation, and she began to work. Her hands moved with a forgotten skill, transforming the rough wood. Slowly, a shape began to emerge. It was nothing grand, nothing money could buy. It was something simple, made of time, patience, and affection. Leo, drawn by the soft sound of the blade on the wood, stopped at a safe distance and watched. Fascinated, he didn't say a word, but for the first time that day, his eyes shone with genuine interest. A little secret was being created, far from the expensive gifts and empty conversations. And on the screen of his monitors, Arthur watched the scene. A pang of something he couldn't name growing in his chest, a feeling that mixed jealousy with a bewildering admiration. The fifth and final candidate was Mariana, a renowned pediatrician and a diplomat's daughter. Arthur had high hopes for her. If anyone could understand and heal Leo's sadness, it would be a professional trained to deal with children. Mariana was kind, intelligent, and radiated a calm that contrasted with the poorly disguised anxiety of the other candidates. She didn't bring expensive toys. Instead, she brought books about animals, about distant planets, about children who overcame great adventures. "I would love to read to you, Leo," she said with a gentle smile, sitting across from him in the mansion's library. Arthur watched from the doorway, a ray of hope illuminating his usually stern face. Mariana began to read a story about a boy exploring a magical forest. Her voice was melodious, with the right intonations. It was perfect, but Leo remained distant. He listened, yes, but it was as if he were watching a movie he wasn't a part of. The story was beautiful, but it wasn't his story. It didn't touch the wounds he carried. Mariana, sensing the lack of connection, tried to change tactics. She asked questions about how he was feeling, using gentle psychological terms, trying to open a channel of communication. But with each attempt, Leo seemed to retreat further into his shell. To him, she wasn't a potential mother, but another doctor trying to fix him, trying to diagnose his grief. The afternoon ended with a polite handshake and the vague promise of another meeting. Arthur watched Mariana leave and felt the full weight of his plan's failure. 5 women, the best his capital and influence could gather, and not one had managed to break through the barrier. The next day, after school, Leo wandered to the back of the garden. Drawn by a silent memory, the tool shed was clean, but the wooden box was still there in the corner, and on top of it, carefully placed, was a small object. Leo approached slowly. It was a boat, but not one of those shiny plastic boats he had by the dozen. It was a tiny boat carved from a walnut shell, with a mast made from a toothpick and a sail from a dried leaf. It was simple, rustic, and infinitely precious. It was the object he had seen Helena carving the day before. He picked it up with both hands, as if holding a fragile treasure. There was no price tag, no designer brand. There was only the work of careful hands and the intention of a gift with no expectations. He ran to the garden fountain and placed the boat in the water. It floated perfectly, moving with the gentle breeze. Leo smiled, a wide, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He spent the entire afternoon there, guiding his little boat, lost in a world of imagination that the expensive gifts had never awakened. From his office high above, Arthur witnessed the scene through his cameras. He saw his son's smile, the first real smile in months. He zoomed in on the screen to get a better look at the object that had worked this miracle, a walnut shell. The irony hit him like a punch. His entire net worth, his investment funds, his accumulated wealth were not worth that single walnut shell. The suspicion he'd felt toward Helena began to crack, giving way to a reluctant and confused admiration. However, Mrs. Albright was also watching from a side window. She saw the boy playing and recognized the object. She remembered seeing Helena fiddling with those old things. Cold fury consumed her. This cleaning woman was going too far, challenging her authority and the rules of the house with these sentimental, inappropriate gestures. She would not allow the order she maintained so rigorously to be subverted by a mere maid. She turned away from the window, her footsteps echoing down the hall with grim determination. Something had to be done to put Helena in her place before it was too late. Mrs. Albright's anger was like a storm forming on the horizon, silent but charged with electricity. She didn't confront Helena directly. Her strategy was more subtle and cruel, designed to isolate and demoralize. It started with small things. Helena began to receive the worst tasks, the ones no one wanted: scrubbing the bathroom grout with a toothbrush, polishing the silverware until her reflection was perfect under the housekeeper's unforgiving light, organizing the dusty attic where the heat was unbearable. These were orders given with a cutting coldness, each word a reminder of her inferior position. The other staff members, sensing the shift in atmosphere and fearing the housekeeper's wrath, began to distance themselves from Helena. Conversations in the staff dining room would cease when she approached. "Good morning." Smiles became hesitant nods. She was being turned into an outcast, a faulty piece in the well-oiled machine of the mansion. Despite the pressure, Helena refused to break. She performed her duties with the same diligence as always, her head held high. What sustained her was the small miracle she had witnessed. Every day, she saw Leo with the walnut shell boat. He carried it in his pocket, placed it beside his plate during meals, and sometimes she would see him whispering to the tiny leaf sail, as if telling it a secret. The boy's quiet joy was her armor, a shield against the hostility that surrounded her. She knew she had done the right thing. She had connected with him in a way that went beyond class barriers and house rules, and that connection was a wealth Mrs. Albright could never confiscate. Arthur, immersed in his business and the failure of his matrimonial plan, was slow to notice the silent war unfolding under his roof. He noticed the exhaustion in Helena's eyes, the dust smudges on her otherwise immaculate uniform, but he attributed it to hard work. His mind, trained to spot major anomalies in the stock market, was not programmed to decipher the microaggressions of a domestic war. Yet, something bothered him. He found himself looking for her on the security cameras, no longer with suspicion, but with a growing curiosity. He watched her working tirelessly, the dignity in her posture, the care in her gestures. And then he would see her gaze soften whenever it met Leo's. A shared look of complicity that lasted only a second, but contained a universe of understanding. Mrs. Albright realizing her methods were not having the desired effect, decided to escalate. She knew the most effective weapon against someone like Helena wasn't hard work, but humiliation. During dinner one evening, while Arthur was distractedly reading his emails on his tablet, the housekeeper entered the room with a grave expression. "Sir," she said, her voice heavy with false concern, "I must report an incident. A diamond brooch belonging to the late Mrs. Arthur, which was on her vanity table, has gone missing." She paused dramatically. The only person who cleaned the room today was the new cleaner, Helena. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and venomous. Arthur looked up from his tablet, his brow furrowed. He looked at Mrs. Albright, whose face was a mask of integrity, and a cold knot formed in his stomach. He didn't want to believe it, but the seed of doubt, planted by his own initial suspicion, began to sprout. The housekeeper knew exactly where she was striking, at the very thing a man like Arthur valued most: the security of his assets, the sanctity of his estate. The silence that followed Mrs. Albright's accusation was heavier than any word. Arthur felt a cold wave wash over him. The diamond brooch wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was one of Clara's favorites, a gift he had given her on their first wedding anniversary. It held a sentimental value that transcended any market price. His corporate mind, trained to assess risk and make fact-based decisions, clashed with an intuition he barely recognized. The image of Helena smiling at his son, the warmth in her eyes, the kindness in the hands that had created a walnut boat, none of it fit the profile of a thief. Yet Mrs. Albright had been the epitome of loyalty and efficiency for years. Her word had always been law in this house. "Bring her in," Arthur said, his voice low and tense, hating himself for the suspicion the order implied. Helena was brought to the dining room. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She looked at Arthur, not with fear, but with a quiet dignity that disarmed him. The housekeeper repeated the accusation, her voice dripping with venom. "Mrs. Arthur's brooch is missing. You were the only one in the room." Helena took a deep breath. "Sir, I would never do such a thing. I cleaned the room, yes, but I touched nothing that wasn't part of my job." Mrs. Albright smirked, an almost imperceptible gesture. "Naturally, that's what you would say." She turned to Arthur. "Sir, with your permission, a search of her belongings would resolve the matter quickly. The suggestion was humiliating, a calculated violation." Arthur hesitated. He looked at Helena's face, searching for a sign of guilt, and found nothing but profound sadness. He was about to consent, yielding to the cold logic of the situation, when a small voice echoed from the doorway. "She didn't take it." Everyone turned. Leo stood there in his pajamas, his eyes fixed on the housekeeper with a fury no one had ever seen in him. In his hands, he clutched the tiny walnut shell boat. "It was you," he said, his voice surprisingly firm for a 7-year-old. "I saw you. You took the brooch from Mommy's jewelry box and put it in Helena's apron pocket in the laundry room." The world seemed to stop. The turning point wasn't the boy's accusation, but what happened next. Leo took a step forward, his eyes filling with tears. "Did I know why you did it? Because she gave me the boat, because she sings my song, and you don't like it when I'm happy." A child's confession, pure and unshakable, struck Arthur like a bolt of lightning. He needed no more proof. He looked at Mrs. Albright, whose once controlled face was now pale and twisted with shock and panic. The mask had fallen, revealing the cruelty behind the facade of loyalty. In that instant, Arthur saw everything with painful clarity: his son's loneliness, the veiled hostility toward Helena, the housekeeper's manipulation. He had treated his son's happiness like a business deal, trying to buy a solution, while true human connection was treated as a threat to the order of his house. He felt like a fool, a billionaire blinded by his own logic. The diamond brooch was just an object. His son's loyalty, the pure love he showed for Helena, that was a priceless treasure, an asset he had almost allowed to be destroyed. He slowly knelt, his gaze fixed on his son, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a mogul, but just a father who had failed terribly. Leo's revelation shattered the oppressive atmosphere of the mansion. Mrs. Albright, caught in her own web of lies, crumbled, words failed her, and the authority she had wielded so rigorously evaporated, leaving only a pathetic, trembling figure. Arthur, still on his knees, didn't need to say a word. His gaze, a mixture of cold fury and profound disappointment, was enough. He gestured to the head of security, who was waiting discreetly by the door. "Escort Mrs. Albright off the property. Immediately, her belongings will be sent to her." There was no argument, no appeal. The housekeeper's reign ended abruptly and silently, a footnote on the estate's balance sheet. After she was gone, a different kind of silence filled the room. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but a quiet space where emotions, so long repressed, could finally breathe. Arthur stood and walked over to Helena. He stopped before her, and for the first time, he truly saw her. Not as an employee, a cog in the machine, but as the woman who had shown more compassion and understanding for his son than anyone else. "Helena," he began, his voice hoarse. There are no words to express how wrong I was. My suspicion, my blindness. I ask for your forgiveness." Helena looked at him, and in her eyes there was no triumph, only a genuine empathy for the pain she saw on the face of this powerful, yet so very lost man. "You don't need my forgiveness, sir. You just need to take care of your son." Her gaze shifted to Leo, who was still standing in the doorway, clutching his boat like an anchor. Arthur's heart contracted. She was right. All his deals, his stock investments, his fortunes in dollars and euros, meant nothing if he couldn't take care of the most precious asset he owned. In the days that followed, the dynamic of the house changed completely. Arthur, humbled, asked Helena to stay, not just as an employee, but as an essential presence in Leo's life. He offered her a generous salary, a room in the main wing of the house, but she declined. "My work is what gives me my dignity." "Yes, sir," she said simply, "but I will accept staying close to Leo." They reached an agreement. She would become Leo's companion, a sort of personal governess, but without the rigid formalities of the past. The change was subtle but profound. The house began to feel less like a museum and more like a home. The relationship between Arthur and Helena also began to transform. The admiration he felt for her, born from that incident, blossomed into a deep respect. He began to watch her not through cameras, but with his own eyes. He saw the patience with which she taught Leo to tie his shoes, the joy with which they planted seeds in a small garden bed, the way her laughter filled the corridors that once echoed with loneliness. He found himself drawn to her authenticity, her calmness, to an inner richness that couldn't be measured in capital. And in watching her, he began to feel something he hadn't felt since Clara was gone. A flicker of hope, the possibility of a new beginning, an investment of the heart that promised a return he had never imagined. Mrs. Albright's departure left a power vacuum that Arthur chose not to fill. He dismissed any staff who had shared the former housekeeper's rigidity and lack of humanity, opting for a smaller, warmer team. The mansion, once a sanctuary of protocol and silence, began to come alive. The sound of Leo's laughter echoed through the halls, a melody worth more than all the dividends from his stock portfolio. Helena, now officially the boy's caregiver, brought a new atmosphere to the home. Small vases of wildflowers appeared on windowsills, and the smell of baking cake occasionally replaced the sterile scent of cleaning products. Arthur, for the first time in years, began to delegate more of his business responsibilities. He started leaving the office earlier, not to analyze the crypto market, but to participate in small rituals that had become sacred. He would join Leo and Helena in the garden, where he learned the names of plants and helped water their small plot. He discovered his son had a remarkable talent for drawing and spent hours sitting beside him, just watching as Leo created entire worlds on sheets of paper. These were moments of pure connection, filling a void he hadn't even known was there. His net worth continued to grow, but he was discovering a new kind of wealth, an emotional cash flow that enriched him in a completely new way. The relationship between him and Helena deepened at a slow, natural pace. They talked over dinner, not about business or finance, but about her childhood, the stories her father used to tell, the simple dreams she cherished. Arthur became fascinated by her worldview, her ability to find joy in the simplest things. She, in turn, began to see beyond the facade of the ruthless billionaire. She saw a man who loved his son desperately, but didn't know how to show it. She saw the sorrow in his eyes when he spoke of Clara, and the vulnerability he tried to hide behind a wall of self-sufficiency. One afternoon, Arthur found Helena in the library, looking at a portrait of Clara that hung over the fireplace. She was very beautiful, Helena said, with a sincerity devoid of any envy or ulterior motive. Arthur moved to stand beside her, his heart heavy with memories. She was the soul of this house, he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. When she left, she took all the color with her. Helena looked at him, her eyes full of a compassion that touched him deeply. The colors never really leave, sir. Sometimes we just forget how to see them. That night, something extraordinary happened. Leo had a nightmare. He woke up screaming, calling for his mother. Arthur rushed to the room, followed by a recently hired night nanny. They both tried to calm the boy, but his panic was deep, a terror that words of comfort couldn't reach. Arthur felt the same old impotence, a desperation that made him want to call a doctor, an ambulance, anyone who could solve the problem. It was then that Helena, having heard the screams from her room, appeared at the door. She was still in her simple pajamas, her face creased from sleep. "Excuse me, sir," she said quietly. "May I try?" Arthur, desperate, just nodded. The nanny, offended by the intrusion, stepped back with a disdainful look, certain the former cleaner would have no more success than she had. Helena entered the room, and the atmosphere seemed to instantly change. She didn't rush to hug Leo, nor did she bombard him with questions or comforting platitudes. Instead, she pulled a small chair to the bedside and sat down, at a respectful distance. The room, lit only by the soft glow of a nightlight, was silent except for the boy's intermittent sobs as he huddled under the covers. Arthur and the nanny watched from the doorway, witnesses to a scene that defied all their expectations. "I know a story," Helena began, her voice as soft as a whisper. The same voice she used to hum the little bird song. "It's not about princes or castles or dragons. It's about a little bird who was afraid to fly." Leo stopped sobbing. He peeked out from over the comforter, his red, swollen eyes fixed on Helena. She continued, the narrative flowing calmly and steadily. She didn't gesture, didn't raise her voice for dramatic effect. She just told the story. It was the story of a little sparrow who watched his siblings fly away, exploring the blue sky, but his own wings trembled at just the thought of looking down. He was afraid of falling, afraid of the unknown, afraid of leaving the safety of the nest. Helena described the nest with details Leo could almost feel. The warmth of the twigs, the softness of the down, the security it offered. But she also described the beauty of the world outside, the warmth of the sun, the caress of the wind, the colors of the flowers that could only be seen from above. The story wasn't about forcing the little bird to fly, it was about understanding his fear. The mother bird didn't push him. She just sat beside him every day and told him stories of the sky's beauty, until one day, the little sparrow's curiosity became greater than his fear. As Helena spoke, Leo slowly emerged from his shell of panic. He sat up in bed, his gaze fixed on her face, completely captivated. The story of the little bird was his own story. The fear of flying was his fear of living in a world without his mother. The safe nest was the memory of her that he guarded so carefully. Helena, with her instinctive wisdom, had given him a metaphor for his pain, a way to understand it without having to name it directly. When the story ended, with the little bird taking his first wobbly flight toward the sun, Leo's eyes were heavy with sleep. The anguish had been replaced by a deep calm. He lay back down, and within minutes he was asleep, his breathing even and peaceful. Helena remained seated for another moment, just watching him, making sure he was at peace. Arthur, standing in the doorway, felt tears streaming down his face. He hadn't cried like this since Clara's death. It was a staggering revelation. He, with all his money, with access to the world's best specialists, had never been able to provide his son with that level of comfort and understanding. He had tried to solve Leo's pain with things, with gifts, with external solutions. Helena, with nothing more than a story and an empathetic heart, had healed the wound from the inside. The nanny beside him was silent, her arrogance replaced by mute astonishment. In that moment, in the quiet of the bedroom, Arthur understood. The selection process he had initiated had been wrong from the start. He had been looking for a replacement for his wife, a new CEO for his family. But what Leo needed, what they both needed, wasn't a figure of status or a woman of great wealth. It was someone who knew the story of the little bird. The night of the nightmare marked an irreversible change in Arthur's heart. The admiration he felt for Helena deepened into something more. Something he hesitantly began to recognize as affection. He found himself seeking her company, not just for Leo's sake, but for his own. The conversations at the end of the day became longer, more personal. He spoke of the pressure of managing his empire, of the loneliness he felt at the top, feelings he had never shared with anyone. Helena listened with genuine attention, offering not corporate solutions, but a human perspective that soothed him and made him feel understood. The attraction between them grew subtly, built on a foundation of mutual respect and the affection they both shared for Leo. It was visible in the lingering glances across the dinner table, the way he would instinctively touch her arm to get her attention, the way she would smile when he told a bad joke. Leo, with the keen perception of children, sensed the change in the atmosphere. He saw the way his father looked at Helena, and instead of jealousy, he felt a sense of completion. He drew family pictures, and more, his drawings showed 3 people holding hands under a smiling sun. However, Arthur was still a man of plans and strategies. The corporate logic that had guided his entire life had not vanished completely. He felt he needed closure, a formal conclusion to the process he had so disastrously begun. Furthermore, there was the matter of society, of the elite circle in which he lived. Rumors were rampant about the departure of the 5 candidates and the dismissal of Mrs. Albright. He needed to present a united front, a final decision that would silence the gossip and establish the new order in his home. It was then that he decided to host a grand event at the mansion. Officially, it was a charity gala, an event to raise funds for a children's hospital. But privately, he knew it would be the stage for the climax of his search. He invited the city's elite, CEOs, politicians, socialites, and, in a move that surprised everyone, he also invited the 5 candidates who had participated in his selection. It was a bold gesture, a way to close that chapter publicly. He wanted everyone to see the choice that he, and more importantly, his son had made. Preparations for the event were frantic. The mansion was decorated with flowers and lights, transformed into a fairy tale setting. Helena, due to her position, was responsible for overseeing the arrangements with the new team, ensuring everything was perfect. She moved with her usual efficiency, but there was a shadow of uncertainty in her eyes. She didn't understand the purpose of this grand event, nor why Arthur had invited those women back to his home. A part of her feared he had reconsidered. that the logic of his world, the allure of wealth and status, had finally reasserted itself. She loved Leo with all her heart, and the thought of being separated from him was a physical pain. As she arranged the silver on the immense dining table, she wondered if her time in this dream world was about to end. The night of the gala was approaching, and with it, a tension that promised to change everyone's lives forever. The night of the gala arrived, and the mansion gleamed under the weight of its own opulence. Luxury cars glided up the driveway, depositing guests dressed in silk and adorned with jewels that sparkled like constellations. The air was thick with expensive perfume, soft classical music, and the murmur of conversations about business, the stock market, and the latest art acquisitions. It was Arthur's world in its purest form, a spectacle of power and wealth. The 5 candidates arrived like princesses at a ball, each more stunning than the last, their polished smiles hiding their curiosity and tension. They greeted Arthur with a studied formality, their eyes searching for any sign that would reveal the night's purpose. Helena and the other staff were rigidly confined to the service area. The new head of staff, though kinder than Mrs. Albright, was inflexible about protocol during events of this magnitude. Helena could hear the sounds of the party from the other side of the kitchen door, a world of glitter and laughter from which she was excluded. Her heart was tight with a mixture of anxiety and resignation. She tried to focus on her work, but her mind was in the main hall as with Leo and Arthur. The boy, dressed in a small, tailor-made suit, looked like a miniature prince, but Helena knew the discomfort behind his eyes. He hated large, noisy events. At the height of the evening, Arthur stepped onto a small stage set up in the ballroom. The conversations ceased, and all eyes turned to him. Beside him stood Leo, clutching his hand tightly. Arthur thanked everyone for their presence, spoke briefly about the importance of charity, and then paused, creating a silence heavy with anticipation. "As many of you know," he began, his voice firm and clear, "I have been going through a period of transition, and on this journey I've learned that the greatest investment a man can make is not in stocks or in gold, but in the happiness of his family." He turned and knelt in front of his son, ignoring the hundreds of pairs of eyes watching them. He placed his hands on Leo's shoulders, the microphone carrying his voice throughout the hall. "My son," he said, his voice thick with an emotion no one there would ever have associated with the ruthless businessman. "All of these women here tonight are wonderful, intelligent, and kind, but I want you to know that the final choice was always yours. I want to know, who would you like to stay with us forever?" The hall held its breath. It was a moment of pure drama, more gripping than any Wall Street negotiation. The 5 women straightened up, their smiles frozen in a mixture of hope and nervousness. Leo looked at them, one by one. He saw Isabella's elegance, Beatrice's energy, Sophia's beauty, Valentina's artistry, and Mariana's calm. They were all beautiful, all smiling at him, but his eyes didn't linger on any of them. They swept the room, past the faces of the guests, searching for something, for someone, and then he saw her. Near the kitchen door, left ajar by a passing waiter, he caught a glimpse of a familiar, gentle face. Helena was peeking out, her heart in her throat, unable to stay away. Their eyes met for a single, powerful second. In that instant, a child's decision as pure and unshakable as a nation's treasure changed everything. He ran, without a word, without a backward glance. Leo let go of his father's hand and ran. His small leather shoes made little sound on the thick carpet, but his movement was a thunderclap in the silent hall. He ran past the silk gowns and glittering jewels, a small missile of pure, determined love. On a direct course for the kitchen door, the guests parted in surprise, creating a pathway for the child. The 5 candidates watched, their smiles finally crumbling into masks of shock and embarrassment. Helena, seeing the boy running toward her, took an instinctive step back, as if she couldn't believe what was happening. But there was no escaping this moment. Leo threw himself into her arms with a force that nearly unbalanced her. He buried his face in her simple uniform, his small arms squeezing her with desperate strength. Helena caught him, instinct overriding all protocol. She hugged him back, smelling his hair, feeling the warmth of his small body, and all the fear and uncertainty she had felt dissolved in that embrace. From the middle of the ballroom, Leo's voice rang out, loud and clear, amplified by the stunned silence. "Her," he said, his face still hidden in Helena's shoulder. "Oh, I choose Helena. She knows the story of the little bird." The phrase, so simple and childlike, was a bombshell. It left everyone in complete shock. The city's elite stared, dumbfounded, at the scene in the service doorway. The heir to one of the country's greatest fortunes in the arms of a cleaner. The 5 women, caught between indignation and public humiliation, didn't know where to look. And Arthur, still kneeling in the middle of the room, was no longer a multimillionaire, nor a billionaire. He was just a man, a father, breaking down in tears of relief and regret as he realized that the love he had been searching for in luxury catalogues, the real treasure, the most profitable of all investments, had been polishing the floors of his house all along. He rose slowly, his face wet with tears, and walked toward them. There was no longer an audience, no longer an event. There was only his family. He stopped in front of Helena, who was still holding Leo. "He's right," Arthur said, his voice choked but firm. The choice was always his. He reached out a hand, not as a boss but as an equal, and touched Helena's face with a tenderness that surprised them both. "Helena, would you forgive me for being so blind? Would you stay with us? Not as an employee, but as the woman my son's heart has chosen. As the woman my heart is choosing now." Helena looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears she didn't bother to hide. She glanced down at Leo's trusting face, now smiling up at her from between her and his father. In that moment, she knew she had found her place in the world. It wasn't a place defined by money or status, but by a genuine love and a connection that transcended every social barrier. "Yes," she whispered, the answer a gift to the 2 men in her life. "I'll stay." Arthur pulled her into an embrace, enveloping both her and Leo at once. And there, in the doorway between opulence and simplicity, the 3 of them became a family, bound not by contracts or inheritances, but by the invisible, unbreakable bonds of the heart. The party was over, but the real celebration was just beginning. Thank you for your patience and collaboration throughout this journey. It has been a pleasure building this story with you. The next morning dawned bright and full of promise. The echo of the previous night's scandal still reverberated through the city's social circles, but inside the mansion, a profound peace had settled. Arthur's first decisions as the new patriarch of his small family were swift and decisive. He dismissed the event staff, cancelled all future social engagements, and most importantly, sat with Helena and Leo at the kitchen table, not the formal dining room, for breakfast. It was a symbolic act that declared an end to an era of appearances and the beginning of a life of authenticity. Together, they began to redesign their world. The silent corridors were filled with music. The untouched playroom was transformed into an art studio where Leo and Helena painted with their fingers, and Arthur awkwardly tried to carve more boats from walnut shells. The fortune that once served to build walls was now used to build bridges. Arthur established a foundation in Clara's name, dedicated to helping children who had lost a parent, with Helena as its director. His knowledge of capital and investments now served a greater purpose: to generate profit for healing broken hearts. The affection between Arthur and Helena, born of admiration and cemented by their love for Leo, blossomed into a tender and true romance. They walked through the gardens holding hands, shared stories under the stars, and discovered in each other the kind of partnership they both thought they would never find again. He taught her about the world of business, not to impress her, but to share his passion. And she taught him to find joy in a sunset, to listen to the birdsong, to treasure the wealth of simple moments. The empire Arthur built was not dismantled, but transformed. It remained a monument, but no longer to solitude. It became a monument to second chances, to hope, and to the undeniable truth that the greatest wealth is not in the assets one accumulates, but in the bonds one forms. The money, the fortune, the estate, it was all still there, but now it was merely a tool, a means to a much nobler end, the building of a home. Some time later, on a sunny spring afternoon, the three of them sat by the edge of the estate's lake. Leo, now a happy, talkative boy, was sailing his walnut-shell boat, which remained his most precious toy. Arthur watched Helena, whose smile lit up the world around her. He had spent his life chasing the next big deal, the next billion-dollar acquisition, only to realize that the best investment of his life had been to simply open his heart. He hadn't needed a selection process to find love. He had only needed to learn to see it where it had been all along, in the small details, in the quiet kindness, in the story of a little bird who was afraid to fly. The silent palace finally had its queen. The sad prince had his joy, and the lonely king had found his true kingdom. Together, they were proof that the most valuable inheritance of all is, and always will be, love.